Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. The topic of this lecture is the period between the two great wars, World War I and World War II. But first we need to finish the story of World War I. And we discussed the reasons why the United States finally got into World War I in 1917. But one of the reasons that Woodrow Wilson came around to wanting to participate in this war was his desire to be at the table when the peace talks happened after the war, because as we've discussed before, he was a very idealistic man. He believed God had chosen him for a mission, and part of that mission was to bring peace and democracy to the entire world. So he wanted to be a player at the peace talks. Even before the war was over, in January 1918, Wilson made a very famous speech in which he laid out 14 points, that is, 14 aspects of a possible solution to the war, and aspects of a possible settlement after the war. Some of these were national self-determination. If you look at the map, you see what happened after World War I was that the old multinational empires like the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were broken up into smaller nations. And the point of this was simply nationalism, the old desire that each nation, each ethnic group should have its own separate country. And that was achieved to some extent after World War I, although not completely. And that would be one of the problems leading up to World War II, as we'll see. Second, Wilson called for disarmament by the major powers, trying to prevent another arms race of the sort that had contributed to the outbreak of World War I. Third, free trade. Wilson believed commerce was one way to promote world peace. But above all, Wilson advocated the creation of an international organization known as the League of Nations. Now, this was similar to our modern-day United Nations. The idea was that all nations would be represented, and that this organization would work to promote and to maintain the peace so that war would never again occur. And it's very significant, I think, that the document that did create the League of Nations is called the League of Nations Covenant. If you remember, covenant was an important concept in the Presbyterian theology that Woodrow Wilson believed in, as an agreement between God and humanity. So I think clearly here again we see Wilson's sense of himself as a leader sent by God to help bring peace to humanity. And another goal that Wilson had, I think, was to try to put a sort of positive spin on the war, in a sense, or at least to try to convince people that some good could come out of the war. There had been so much terrible suffering, and it seemed senseless. It seemed that it had happened for no very good reason. But when Wilson came into the picture, he promoted the idea that the Great War was indeed meaningful in that it was so terrible that humanity would never again be willing to go to war. In other words, World War I would be the war to end all wars. Now, that may sound like a dream, and in some sense it was. It had very religious overtones, and indeed, Wilson decided to do something very unusual for an American president at that time, which was to go personally to the peace conference, which was held at the Palace of Versailles near Paris in France. It was very unusual for presidents to leave the country back then, but he went in person, and before he went to Versailles, he toured around all over Europe, and everywhere he went, there were parades, and people came out and threw flowers in his path and the street and hailed him as the savior of Europe, with almost messianic overtones. And the other leaders at the peace conference picked up on this, and it made them a little resentful. For example, the Prime Minister of France, Georges Clemenceau, commented about Wilson, quote, 14 points, that's a bit much. The good Lord had only 10. um, and it's also the case that Wilson's dreams for bringing good out of the evil of the Great War were stifled to a large extent by the attitude of the French and the British. Now, you have to understand, though, that the French and British had suffered much more than we had in the war. As we said, practically an entire generation of young men had been wiped out in both of those countries, and frankly, they wanted revenge. And so the goal of France and Britain at the peace talks was to weaken Germany to such a great extent that there would never be the slightest chance that Germany would ever start a war like World War I again. And in fact, that idea that Germany had started the war became a key part of the peace treaty. The famous Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles says that the German Reich, the German Empire, was entirely and totally responsible for the outbreak of World War I. Now, based on what we know about how it came about, I think we can probably all agree that that's ridiculous. For example, Austria-Hungary seemed to have a great deal more to do with it than Germany did, but Austria-Hungary had fallen apart, it no longer existed, and it wasn't around to take the blame. And so all of the blame for World War I fell squarely on the shoulders of the Germans. And on that basis, the treaty required Germany to pay the enormous sum of 132 billion German marks, that was their currency, in gold, not in paper. Now, I don't know exactly how much that is in modern money, but just to give you a sense of the scale of these reparations payments, as they were called, take I just pause for a moment and ask you to think about the year when Germany might have finally paid this off. If you take a guess, I bet you'd be wrong, because Germany only finally paid off the war reparations for World War I in the year 2010. They made the last payment. That's how big this payment really was. And it had huge economic ramifications for Germany, as we'll see later. But although Wilson was defeated in his attempt to keep the Allies from punishing Germany in the treaty, he did get the main thing that he wanted, which was the creation of the League of Nations. However, in the American system, it's not enough for the president to simply sign and agree to a treaty. A treaty then has to be ratified by the United States Senate. And at this point in time, the Senate was controlled by the Republican Party, many of whom were isolationists, and like Senator Borah, who we had the document from last time, who had absolutely no interest in committing the United States to joining the League. And in the documents you had, we saw the arguments pro and con by Wilson and Borah. This was a tough fight for the president, and so he decided to take his case directly to the voters. So he traveled about 10,000 miles by train, going all over the country, making dozens and dozens of speeches, and really exhausting himself. When he got to Pueblo, Colorado in late September, Wilson collapsed from the strain, and he had to be rushed back to the White House, where a couple of days later, on October the 2nd, 1919, Woodrow Wilson suffered a very severe paralytic stroke in the White House, and really became almost incapacitated for the remainder of his term in office. He had all the usual symptoms of stroke. The left side of his face drooped. He was paralyzed partially on the left side of his body, and he completely lost the ability to speak for some time. But the American people didn't know about this. In those days, the media tended to hush up anything that might reflect badly on the president in the eyes of the voters. And so there was a big cover-up, and people never really became aware of the extent of Wilson's illness. Partly because the First Lady, Wilson's second wife, Edith Galt Wilson, did such a good job of managing the business and the workflow of the White House while Wilson was sick. Now, eventually, Wilson did regain the power of speech, and he did begin to take an interest in politics and to try to play a role, especially in the debate over the League of Nations. But Wilson's stroke, unfortunately, brought out the worst aspects of his character. We've talked before about his stubbornness, his belief that he was generally right and the rest of the world was wrong. And you see those qualities really emerge after the stroke. For example, one senator who came to the White House was told by Wilson, quote, "Anyone who opposes me in that," meaning the treaty, "I'll crush," end quote. Now, the Republican leaders of the Senate came to Wilson and said, look, we will ratify the Treaty of Versailles, but we just want to put in some reservations. For example, we'd like to add a statement that the United States will never have to go to war without the permission of Congress, that will never be dragged into a war simply by virtue of our membership in the League. But Wilson was not willing to budge an inch, absolutely refused to meet the Republicans halfway, and the result was that the United States Senate voted down the Treaty of Versailles. And actually, we never ratified it and had to make a separate peace treaty with Germany, actually. But the main result of this was that the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. And it's interesting to speculate the effect that that had on European history. What if we had joined? Would the prestige and the military power of the United States perhaps have been able to stop the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, stop the rise of Hitler? We'll never know. But the important thing is that it never happened, and the United States went back into isolationist mode for nearly 20 years and played very little role in broader world affairs. Now, let's talk about the rise of the Soviet Union. Excuse me one second, I'm going to have to make this a little smaller, just this one slide. We talked about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia during World War I that ultimately led to the withdrawal of Russia from the war. Now, when the Bolshevik Party, led by Lenin, came to power, of course, they promised a free and open and equal society. But soon, people began to realize that was not going to be the case. For example, there was an election in Russia in November of 1917, and when the results were counted, it was revealed that the Bolshevik Party had only won 29% of the vote, and that their days were numbered at the head of the new government. But Lenin's response was simply to refuse to allow the new assembly, which had been elected, to have a meeting. And so the Bolsheviks continued to govern the country as a one-party state. Now, in July 1918, they did draft a constitution which supposedly allowed the people of the USSR the right of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. But in reality, the Soviet Union became an authoritarian regime marked by surveillance of the citizens, a secret police force called the Cheka, which later morphed into a group called the KGB, kept tabs on all the citizens. And furthermore, when the Soviet Union was originally created, it was called the Soviet Union because it was supposed to be run at the local level by committees of workers, which were known as Soviets. But as time went on, increasingly, it was the central Bolshevik Party, Communist Party leadership that called the shots, and local workers had almost no input. Now, we have to understand that in doing this, the communists thought that they were doing something wonderful for the workers. They believed the workers had been oppressed for centuries, and that these measures were necessary in the short term in order to establish the workers' state. And so they saw themselves as, quote unquote, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Proletariat is another name for working class. And so all of their dictatorial methods they sincerely believed were necessary if the workers were going to get what they deserved from the government. But really, over time, you see Soviet communism become more and more of an authoritarian regime. Excuse me just a second. We'll get back to that point where we were. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, so in summer of 1918, the Bolsheviks officially named themselves the Communist Party, and immediately a civil war broke out between the communists, who were called the Reds because their official color was red, and the anti-communists, who were known as the Whites. Now, the Whites were royalists. They supported the Tsar and the royal family, with some rather half-hearted support from the British and the U.S. But this was a very bloody and brutal civil war, and the communists used it to justify even stricter measures carried out against the population. For example, confiscating food and other property of the wealthier peasants, and also taking over certain sectors of industry and nationalizing them, that is, having the state run them for the benefit of the public, supposedly. So this war communism represented a major attack on the institution of private property. And also there was an attack on civil rights. Starting in September 1918, you begin to see massive slaughter of people who were believed to be enemies to the communist revolution. Sound familiar? It should. It's very similar to what happened during the period known as the Terror in the French Revolution. So historians often call this the Red Terror, in which anyone who was believed to be an enemy to the Communist Party was eliminated. And it was also during this period of the Red Terror that the Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and all of their children were shot and killed, including the Grand Duchess Anastasia, who for many years there were rumors that Anastasia had somehow managed to escape the slaughter of her family. But a couple of years ago, her remains were found near the final resting place of the rest of her family. And so we now know that Anastasia, too, did die with the rest of the Romanovs there in Russia. The Bolsheviks, the communists, did win the Civil War. And once they had secured their hold on power in March 1921, Lenin announced a quote-unquote new economic policy which did allow people to have private property again for a while. But his successor, Joseph Stalin, would quickly take steps to undo this more lenient policy. Stalin presented himself as the hand-picked heir of Lenin. The photograph on the right was actually not real. It was something that was doctored and retouched by Stalin to make it look like he and Lenin were best buddies. And his PR campaign was successful. He became the dictator of the Soviet Union for almost 30 years. And it was Stalin who really launched an all-out war on the institution of private property with his 5-year plan, lasting from 1928 to 1933, in which peasants who owned land were forced to surrender their land to groups known as communes. And so essentially, the land was now being owned by collective groups of farmers who were supposed to farm the land cooperatively. And you can imagine what the effect was on agricultural productivity. It really plummeted during this 5-year plan, and there was a lot of resistance, of course, from people who didn't want their land to be taken away from them. And Stalin met this resistance with brutal repression, murdering hundreds of thousands of peasants who dared to resist this policy, and sending somewhere around 2 million more to labor camps in the frozen reaches of Siberia, way far east in Russia. These were known as gulags, and they were kind of a prototype for Nazi concentration camps in which people were simply worked to death. Also, it was thanks to Stalin that the famous show trials took place between 1936 and 1938, in which Stalin, in the classic paranoid style of all dictators, simply eliminated all of his political enemies, or anyone who he thought might be opposed to his regime. Before they were slaughtered, they were put on trial, but of course all the trials were rigged, resulting in the conviction and execution of somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million Soviet citizens. By 1937, 7 million Soviet citizens were in the gulags. However, visitors from other countries in Western Europe and from America as well flocked to the Soviet Union. They were very interested in this new project of the workers' paradise, the workers' state, and of course they never saw the gulags, they never saw the show trials. What Stalin showed them were new schools, and actually quite a few new colleges and schools were opened under Stalin, and model factories and so forth. So often these rather naive visitors would go back to their home countries just brimming with praise for the wonderfulness of life in Russia under Joseph Stalin. Well, let's turn to Germany now and the situation at the end of World War I. I mentioned that there was a threat of a socialist or communist revolution in Germany just before the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918. Actually, 2 days before that, the Kaiser was forced to abdicate, that is, give up his throne. And the result was the creation of a new government in Germany that became known as the Weimar Republic, and that was named after the city in Germany where its constitution was written. Now, what was the Weimar Republic? Well, it was basically a liberal constitutional regime, somewhat like the United States, but it was more left-leaning than the U.S. government in that it did have a very strong representation of socialists who believed in government intervention in the economy. But what really marked Weimar was a very radical rejection of tradition. Now, after all, the German people had suffered so much during the war, and they were very, very disillusioned. One of the readings that Group 2 will have this time talks about disillusionment by the great psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. They were disillusioned because their parents and their ancestors had made so many mistakes they thought that had led them into this terrible war. And so all of their traditional beliefs essentially they left by the wayside, and the people of Germany began to experiment with new lifestyles. For example, the gay movement really was organized for the first time in Weimar, Germany. There was also a big fad known as Nacktkultur, which means naked culture or nudism. This became very popular throughout Germany. People visiting nudist colonies. This was another innovation of the Weimar Republic. And finally, the first sex change operation was performed in Weimar, Germany, A man named Einar Wegener believed he was really a woman named Lily Elbe, and ultimately died when doctors tried to implant a uterus in his body. There was a movie actually that came out last year, as I speak this in 2016, called The Danish Girl, about Einar Wegener, Lily Elbe. And so you see really radical changes taking place here, and in post-war Europe, because of so much bitterness and despair about the war, people turning away from their traditions and embracing radically different ways of life. Another feature of life in Germany after World War I was the worst inflation that has ever been seen in the world. And this happened because of the reparations payments, because basically all of the gold in Germany was being sent out to pay for reparations. And so in order to have circulating currency, the government had to create paper money, which had absolutely nothing to back it up. And so, as always happens, the value of the money went down drastically. Prices went way, way up. But this was beyond anything ever recorded before in history. To give you a sense of this, in July 1914, with $1 you could buy 4.2 German marks. By November 1923, that same $1 would buy 4.2 trillion. Yes, trillion German marks. And so it was really extraordinary. You know, there were pictures of people with wheelbarrows full of stacks of bills that they're taking down to the corner store to buy one loaf of bread, which might cost 1 billion marks. You know, or these children in this picture who are playing with this worthless money. It's like play money. Now, the United States did decide to step in to try to help the German people, and partly this was just because it was a good business opportunity. American investors realized that in a sense, the German economy had bottomed out, and if they could get in and invest on the ground floor, then they would have a chance to reap profits later. And so, in cooperation with American bankers, the government of Calvin Coolidge launched the Dawes Plan of 1924, in which we lent $110 million to Germany to enable them to pay the reparations and stabilize their economy for the time being. But as we'll see, that wouldn't last very long. Now, disillusionment was one reaction to the war, despair over the terrible violence and suffering that had occurred, but another reaction, believe it or not, was actually to glorify the violence that had been unleashed on the earth with World War I. And this trend started even before the war with a group of artists from Italy known as the Futurists, who in 1909 proclaimed, quote, "We want to glorify war, the only cure for the world," end quote. And so artists, filmmakers, writers, photographers who shared these futurist opinions would often sign on to help with propaganda, PR that is, for rising dictators of the fascist type. Who was the first fascist dictator? Well, this happened in Italy. Benito Mussolini was a young journalist at the beginning of World War I, and he was actually a socialist. So he started out as a left-wing person, but the war experience made him much more conservative very quickly. And in March 1919, he founded a new right-wing party in Italy known as the Fascist Party, and that name comes actually from ancient Roman history. In ancient Rome, the consul, who was the executive of the Roman Republic, everywhere he went, he was attended by a servant who carried a bundle of sticks that was called the fasces. So this was a symbol of power. And Mussolini's goal was to revive the greatness of ancient Rome for the modern Italian state, to make it a powerful state once again. And so the Fascist Party in Italy formed a paramilitary group known as the Black Shirts, who were basically street thugs who engaged in many street brawls with the Communist Party, who were competing for popular support. And because they were anti-communist, the fascists picked up a lot of support from middle-class people who wanted to keep their private property, and also from the Catholic Church, because communism was officially an atheistic ideology, and in the Soviet Union, after the communist takeover there, religion and churches were very much oppressed. And so actually the fascists did, for the time being, get some support from the Catholic Church, although that would be withdrawn later. But this was enough for Mussolini to be named Prime Minister of Italy in October of 1922 by the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III. And then in the following year, the voters of Italy gave the Fascist Party a majority. And so you see here once again the people of Italy voting, in a sense, to turn over their freedom to a dictator. And very quickly, a major cult of personality emerged around the person of Mussolini. One phrase that the dictator encouraged people to have always on their lips: Mussolini is always right. And it's interesting, trying to protect power and masculine strength, Mussolini would also often have himself photographed shirtless, as you see in this picture. I never have quite understood the appeal, because to me he looks just like Mr. Clean. But this is a common tactic by many dictators. For instance, the current Russian dictator Vladimir Putin often does the same thing. It's a way of projecting masculine strength. But really, this adulation of Mussolini took on ridiculous proportions. His title officially was Il Duce, which just meant the leader, kind of like Hitler's title, the Führer, means the leader. And by the 1930s, in newspapers, any articles about Mussolini, the personal pronouns had to be capitalized. He, his, him, they all had to be capitalized, whatever those are in Italian, as if he were actually God. Interestingly enough. But in spite of all this excess, there were people, again, throughout Western Europe, and even in America, who were very interested in this fascist experiment now of Mussolini, as they had earlier been interested in the Soviet experience of communism. Why was that? Well, democracy seemed to have done very little to actually stop World War I. Britain was pretty much democratic. France was a democratic country. So was the U.S. But they had all gotten involved in World War I and suffered destruction from it. So people in the Western world began to ask the question, had democracy become bankrupt? And should we look for a new kind of political system to keep order in the world? And so there was quite a bit of interest among Western intellectuals in fascism. One thing that observers often would say, coming home from Italy, they would say, well, you know, he may be a dictator, but at least he made the trains run on time. And that kind of orderliness had a lot of appeal for people coming out of the carnage of World War I. One author who did think that democracy was finished was the German writer Oswald Spengler, who in 1918 came out with his very popular bestseller called The Decline of the West, in which he predicted that a new type of leader would emerge who would destroy the quote-unquote impotent democracies. Impotent meaning powerless. Another quote from this book, he said, We no longer believe in the power of reason over life. We feel that life rules over reason. End quote. Well, what does that mean? What can we say about that? Well, first of all, reason is out the window, and we can say that the age of reason is over. In a sense, the Enlightenment has ended. What has replaced it? He says life rules over reason. I challenge you to figure out what that actually means. Life in this sentence could mean just about anything. It could mean racial purity. It could mean violence. It could mean any number of things. So it's such a vague statement. But fascist dictators traded on that kind of vague statement, which sounded great, you know, promoting life after all, but really had no content. And of course, the master of that kind of manipulation was Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was actually not from Germany. He was from Austria. He was German-speaking, however. Interestingly enough, Hitler's profession, he was a painter, not a house painter. He was actually an artist, which I think is quite a significant detail about Hitler. Hitler did have an artistic sense, and he used it in some ways very masterfully to manipulate public opinion in Germany, as we shall see when we look at the films of Leni Riefenstahl in the next module. Hitler was very enthusiastic about the outbreak of World War I. How do we know that? Well, look at this picture on the right. This is a very interesting historical document. This picture was taken in Munich, Germany, where Hitler was staying at the time. And it's a large crowd filled with patriotic frenzy cheering the outbreak of World War I. And there you see him with his little mustache there in the crowd in 1914. So excited that his country was going to war. But Hitler was wounded in World War I, and he was also the victim of a poison gas attack. And so he was in the hospital for a while, and he had a lot of time to recuperate and to mull over what had gone wrong for the German-speaking people in the Great War, and to come up with theories about who was to blame for the German defeat. And taking those theories back to Munich, he quickly became the leader of a right-wing club promoting German nationalism in that city, and gave it the new name in German, NSDAP, National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party as it was abbreviated. This was in 1920 that Hitler became the leader of this new Nazi party. Now, like the fascists, the Nazis had their own gang of thugs that was known as the SA, commonly known as the Storm Troopers. And so they went through the streets beating up communists and enemies of the Nazi Party. Their most famous adventure took place in November of 1923 when Hitler planned a coup, that is, a takeover of the government in Munich. This was the government of the German region of Bavaria, headquartered in Munich. The leaders of Bavaria were attending a political rally in a beer hall in Munich, and so Hitler had the SA surround the beer hall and kidnap the leaders. This was known as the Beer Hall Putsch, or the Beer Hall Takeover. But it failed miserably, and Hitler and his cronies were arrested, and Hitler was put on trial. Now, believe it or not, for kidnapping the leaders of the government in Bavaria, Hitler was sentenced to only 5 years in prison, and as it turned out, he only wound up serving a year in prison, and the whole time he was there, it was a very relaxed environment. Visitors could come and go as they pleased, more or less. So, in a sense, this was almost like a vacation for Hitler, and it gave him the chance to write his book, which he called Mein Kampf, which means my struggle. And what was he struggling for? Well, Basically, Hitler wanted to reunite the German people, to make them great again. Um, One feature of Mein Kampf, of course, is that he blamed the defeat of Germany in World War I on the Jewish people. He believed that the Jews had selfishly sold out Germany, that is, Jewish financiers in the international banking community had conspired to bring about the defeat of Germany somehow. He also called for the improvement of the birth rate among ethnic Germans. And when we'll see this actually, Group 3, you're going to have an excerpt from Mein Kampf, which talks about this desire to improve the German birth rate. And once Germans began having more babies, they would need more Lebensraum, that is, living space. And so it would become necessary for Germany to expand, especially eastward, into Poland, to give these new German people more space to live in. But the main focus of Mein Kampf is Hitler's celebration of what he calls the Aryan race. Now, this term has a long history, and I don't have time to explain it in great detail, but basically the Aryans were people from Central Asia who in ancient times had colonized not only India, but also much of Europe, including Greece. And so these Aryans, Hitler saw as the people who had brought civilization to Europe by creating the magnificent Greek culture. And Hitler believed that the true heirs, the true descendants of the Aryans in the modern world, were ethnic Germans. And so his goal was to promote the growth and expansion of the Aryan race at the expense of Slavic peoples like the Poles, and also, and of course, especially the Jewish people, who he saw as parasites on society. But we'll see Hitler's ideas a little bit more in the readings for this module, so I won't go into further detail, but we'll save that for the discussion boards. Now, Hitler might have been dismissed as just a harmless kook, having been thrown in jail for the beer hall putsch. But developments in terms of the world economy really brought Hitler back to prominence in Germany. And the catalyst for this, of course, was the crash of the New York Stock Exchange in October 1929 that brought about a worldwide economic depression. Now, the United States was very hard hit, obviously, in the Depression. And that meant that the loans which American bankers had given to Germany under the Dawes Plan began to be called in by bankers who needed that money back in their own banks. And so when Americans began to call in these loans, this led to a series of catastrophic bank failures in Germany in 1931. And so out of all the countries in the world, really, Germany and the United States were the ones that were hardest hit and most affected by the Great Depression. And in both countries, citizens looked to the government to help them. But the paths were different. In America, the Democratic nominee in 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was elected president, promising a new deal for Americans to help end the Depression. This involved a great deal of government spending, creation of jobs, programs, and so forth to try to end the Depression. But the response in Germany was that the Nazi Party, building on the anger and resentment people felt about the Depression and the war, became more and more popular, until finally in January of 1933 the Nazis had enough support that Adolf Hitler was named the Chancellor of Germany. And it was interesting, a year later the German House of Parliament, the Reichstag, was burnt to the ground. Some people think by the Nazis themselves as an excuse for what came later. When the Reichstag was burned, Hitler proclaimed himself the Führer, or leader of the German people, with emergency dictatorial powers. And once again, as we've seen with Napoleon I and Napoleon III, a vote was held in August 1934, plebiscite, in which the German people were asked one question: do you want Adolf Hitler to be your absolute ruler? Do you want him to be your Führer? And obviously this wasn't a very fair election. The SA clearly had an influence terrorizing people. Nevertheless, I do want to point out that there was 95.7% voter turnout, and of those voters, 89.9% said, yes, we do want Hitler as our Führer. And I don't mention this by way of criticizing the German people specifically, but I simply think it's an example, once again, of the phenomenon we see throughout world history, that when people are suffering terribly, when they've been through a time of chaos, when they've been through a time of violence, hunger, etc., they are willing to trade liberty for order. And Hitler promised to bring order. He promised to bring jobs and prosperity, and people wanted to hear that. And so they supported Hitler in becoming their Führer. And of course, that left the Nazi Party in control of the state and free to carry out their goals, and especially their campaign against the Jews. So, we're going to talk a little bit more in the next module about Nazi propaganda. The reading that you're having, the other reading by Hitler that every group has about the use of mass meetings, also has to do with manipulating public opinion through propaganda techniques. Well, here's one example of Nazi propaganda before you. This is actually from a children's book called Trust No Fox in the Green Meadow and No Jew on His Oath. So this book, the purpose of it is to teach children stereotypes about Germans and Jews. Now on the left you see the stereotypical German. This is a pure Aryan with blonde hair. And notice how he's obviously a hard-working man. He's carrying a shovel. And he's pretty buffed out. He's muscular. He's tan. And this is the image of the Aryan. A hard-working masculine man works with his hands and produces good fruits for the fatherland. The man on the right is supposedly the typical Jew. Now notice he's very different. Clearly he has some kind of white-collar job. He's probably a banker, or perhaps even some kind of government official, but he's carrying a briefcase, he's got a pencil over his ear. He's clearly an indoor person, not natural and healthy like the Aryan. He's also overweight, suggesting that he's rich and prosperous and perhaps a little selfish and greedy, and he's smoking a cigar. By the way, Hitler didn't drink, didn't smoke, and actually was a vegetarian. So this impression of the Jew here is of someone who's an addict, in a sense, a nicotine addict, who's obese, who's selfish, who's greedy, who's rich, again, who's a parasite on society. Now this is obviously very crude Nazi propaganda, but the Nazis were capable of much more sophisticated propaganda, and in the next module we're going to watch a couple of examples of that. Excerpts from films produced by or directed by a woman named Leni Riefenstahl, and I just want to give you a brief introduction to those films, even though it's in the next module, so you'll know what you're looking at. In 1935, Hitler went to Leni Riefenstahl, who was considered one of the most brilliant up-and-coming filmmakers in Germany, and asked her if she would record a Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, Germany, and turn it into a full-length feature film. And she was somewhat reluctant to do it, but Hitler could be very persuasive, and he talked her into it, and so she produced Triumph of the Will, which became a worldwide success. And really, you know, film historians looking at this film have talked about how technically brilliant it really is. That in terms of her genius, Leni Riefenstahl was one of the great filmmakers of the 20th century. But unfortunately, her career was destroyed by the fact that she agreed to work for Hitler. This was a taint that really ruined her filmmaking career. But she went on to make another film for Hitler in 1936, which was a photographic record of the 1936 Summer Olympic Games, which took place in Berlin. And this was meant to be a showpiece for Nazi ideology. The African American runner Jesse Owens, in a way, spoiled this for Hitler by winning several gold medals, even though he was supposedly from an inferior race. But in any case, Riefenstahl recorded this with the cameras, and this also became a huge international hit, her film of Olympia. And so we're going to look at excerpts from these two very sophisticated Nazi propaganda films and try to get some insight as to how Hitler was able to convince the German people to support him. After all, final word here, the German people were not stupid people. They were not barbaric people. In some ways, they were the most educated, civilized, and cultured people in the world. We're talking about the country that produced Bach and Beethoven and Handel and great writers like Goethe and great philosophers like Kant. These were an incredibly civilized and cultured people. And so the question is, how was Hitler able to win them over? And part of the answer is through very sophisticated use of propaganda. So that is what we're going to do in the next module with the films of Leni Riefenstahl. And so I hope you will look forward to that.